Hi everyone. We are going to get into student development theory. We've broken this out into two different modules within a section of the MOOC because student development theory is actually a semester-long course, and in some programs 2 semesters, to dive really into the relevant information you need to know to understand it as a practitioner in student affairs. Student development theory is broken out into two sections. The research and philosophy side, which is what we're going to go over here, and the next section you're going to get into how to put it into practice. So today is really helping you have some context and understanding as to where it came from, what the history has been, and where student development theory is going in practice. So Student Affairs defines student development theory as a collection of theories related to college students that explains how they grow and develop holistically with increased complexity while enrolled in a post-secondary educational environment. That's a lot of words to basically say these are theories that help us understand how college students might make meaning of their experiences while in college. It is a body of scholarship. This is research-based and has been in research for a very long time, since the early 1960s. And so it guides student affairs and higher education practice. One of the things I think is important to know is that development is defined as the process of becoming increasingly complex. If you think about students who come to colleges and universities, we hope they're growing. We hope as a result of being asked to critically think in their classes and get involved across campus that they are questioning themselves, the world around them, and growing in their thinking and in their identities. And so development is really getting at the heart of that. Specifically, student development theory helps provide the pieces of why, but not all, and we're going to go into that here in a little bit, how students experience college, and it can be beneficial when it helps explain a piece of their world to us. So here are some ways that theory can help student affairs professionals in their work. They can help make meaning of a student's experience. And so you might be working with a student one-on-one or observing them in a group dynamic, and a theory may become relevant to their lived experience. It's also a way to help make decisions and think about how to interpret individuals, environments, and organizations. So specifically, when we're thinking about planning programs or events across campus, sometimes student development theory can really help us in shaping what we want for those environments and events. It can be a possible tool to enrich professionals' work with students, and it can help professionals understand growth in positive and meaningful ways. One of the things I do want to put a caveat in, and we'll talk about it here in a little bit, is that student development theory is not a universal explanation of how all students experience college, nor does it define an identity construction for all who might be perceived into an identity group. And so we're going to get into the limitations of student development theory here in a few slides. So to kind of go over the history of student development theory, it roughly started in the 1960s. There are a few theories that date back earlier than 1960s, but really the bulk of the work started in the 60s. And this was because there were waves of students coming to colleges and universities across the U.S., and professionals working with those students needed to better understand what they were experiencing in their growth. And that was used to help design programs and support services for students. Now, an important part of the research that was done in the 1960s is it was primarily done on white men. And as student development theory has evolved over the past decades, you'll start to see that that's one of the limitations of student development theory, is now our college campuses look very different than all white men. And so we need to be careful that we're not using student development theory as a box that we put every student into. Given that some of that research was done on primarily white men in the 60s, in the 1970s, scholars and practitioners started to acknowledge those limitations when it came to students with diverse backgrounds and identities. And so research began and still continues today on identity development models. And if you go into the early student development theory works in 1970s, you're going to see white identity development and Black identity development, and some of those early theories to help us understand more about identity and how people might perceive or hold their identities. However, again, throw that caveat back in, it's not an identity development model for everyone who might be perceived to hold a certain identity. In the 1980s, then we saw a rise in what are called psychosocial and cognitive structural theories, which focus more on moral development and how students make meaning of their experiences. And this really helped us further design programs and opportunities for students and challenged how they made meaning of their college experiences. And we still are doing this work today because our campuses are diverse. And lots of different students are coming to higher education, and the more we know about their experiences, the better. So starting in the 1990s, kind of into current practices now, student development theory is focusing more than ever on students from diverse backgrounds and privileges. Theory now focuses on self-identification by students. This is a big shift. Prior to some of the current practices, research was done by researchers interpreting an experience of a student rather than empowering the voices of students. And that may not sound that different, but in practice, it's actually a really big shift from a faculty member saying, well, this is what I think a student experiences, to actually a student saying, this is what I experience. So where theory is at now, it's moving away from stepped or staged theories. If you do some research, or you maybe know some theories that came out in the 60s through 80s or even 90s, you're going to see that they're potential models that are stair-stepped, meaning you may need to go through step 1 to get to step 2 to get to step 3. And actually what we're finding as research has advanced is that a student can experience multiple growth points at multiple times, and they're at very different levels depending on their lived experiences and past experiences. So we're really moving away from these stepped or staged models. The other thing that's really important is theories are no longer formulas to put students into boxes, but are now intentional in identifying a developmental process is different for every student who comes to college campuses. And where future work is going, and I just heard a presentation on this at a recent conference, is that researchers now who have spent time looking and empowering identities through diverse voices are starting to look at how does environment and the context in which those identities exist play a role in how people perceive and understand their identities, and how does that impact growth and development for students. And so we're going to get into that more as we dive into some theories in our next section. So how student development theory is used in practice is it does a few different things. So theory provides an explanation, a conceptualization of what might be happening for a student. It can also explain a cause in students' behavior. So I want to use some examples from a transition theory and a few other theories you might have heard about in student affairs work. So in a student's transition, there are actually two models. Bridges' model of transition and Schlossberg's theory of transition can be helpful in working with a student. And in this situation, in talking about conceptualization or explanation of behavior, looking at those theories help us understand that a student in transition might be behaving in a certain way as they're trying to cope with that transition, or it can help us think about how to best support that student in need. So theory might be able to predict the developmental outcomes for a student or influence the learning outcomes for a student. So as I think about a theory called challenge and support, these really resonate in the sense of if we are wanting a student to step outside of their comfort zone, for example, challenge and support is a really great theory that essentially at its most simple form says we should be challenging students enough that they're growing and learning, but not too much that they shut down, and we want to be backing up that challenge with support so that they feel encouraged and empowered to learn in the first place, and that we're not over supporting them or under supporting them in that challenge. And so as we think about theory being able to help us predict some developmental outcomes for a student or learning outcomes for a student, that challenge and support of finding that sweet spot right in the middle of enough challenge for them to learn and grow, but the support to back it up is a really great way of how theory can be used in practice. It can also be helpful in assessing practice and generating research and knowledge. In our next presentation, we're going to talk more about Jones and McEwen's model of multiple identity development. And really at the core of that, we're looking at multiple identities a student can hold, and how those are shaped in practice. And so when we think about intersecting identities and assessing how our practices impact all students, further assessment and research can be done using this theory on that would help generate research and new knowledge for people doing practice with students who hold multiple identities. So I talked a little bit about this before. So student development theory has limitations, and we need to be cautious when using student development theory, as theory is only meant to be a helpful resource, not a fact of student affairs work. We know this, students all learn and grow differently. While some may follow a developmental theory exactly, others may not follow it at all, and I've seen this in my own practice. It's important as student affairs professionals that we get to know the whole student, their lived experiences, their background, and their meaning making, and place those above the outcomes and or processes of a developmental theory. So at its most simplest form, you don't want to look at a student development theory and say, oh, this student, I want this student to experience this stage of this theory, so I'm going to impose that on them. Rather, you're going to want to get to know the student in front of you. And this is the best part of student affairs work. Where did they come from? How did they get to where they are? What's helped them be successful? What challenges have they had? And how can you be a best support or resource for them? And student development theory is a tool in your tool belt, not the tool you use to help frame and support students. So theories are useful to know, but may not be applied in all contexts of student affairs work. It is critical a student affairs practitioner be able to know and identify theories, but also use it in helpful and meaningful ways with students. The other thing that I want to call out is that student development theory can have some assumptions. And so, again, a student development theory is not a universal explanation of how all students experience college. It's not a shortcut. And we want to be cautious of labeling students under certain terms within a theory. It's best to put the whole student first and describe the developmental experiences they might be having. So for example, to work through these assumptions, I want to talk about a hypothetical student that I created named Sam. And Sam, where they're at with their critical thinking is they see things as very dualistic, meaning they see things as one way or the other. There's no real middle ground when it comes to potentially a continuum of what they understand or know about a given topic. So instead of saying Sam is dualistic, you want to say Sam is making sense of the world through a dualistic perspective. So again, you're putting that student first, their whole lived experience first, and then where they might be fitting into that developmental theory. So it's also important to think about the fact that an assumption theories can make is that it defines identity construction for all who might be perceived into an identity group. We want to remember that just because a theory may exist around women's identity development, for example, not all women are going to experience every stage of a model exactly, because we're all different in our backgrounds and lived experiences. Another important assumption to think about is theory is not a shortcut to understanding all students' experiences, and we need to be cautious in labeling students. I just talked about that, so I'm going to leave you all with my thoughts prior to that. And the last thing is, a last assumption that is made is that theories do not describe all the behaviors or changes that are best for all students. It's easy to think that because you might have a team of 25 students that you're working with, that 3 fit that model. And so in your mind, it's easy to say, oh, this will fit for everyone. And it actually may not. And so that's why you're going to hear me say it again, going back to really getting to know your students, understanding their motivations, lived experiences, and attributes becomes a really important part of understanding and using student development theory and putting that student before the theory in the first place. So that kind of wraps up the philosophical or research side of student development theory. And in the next part of the module, we're going to dive more into actually the application, or what we call theory to practice. So taking some of the theories that exist out there and applying them in practice and what that may look like.